We have a wonderful panel today that has joined us from many areas of when we talk about fair housing and assistance animals, because we know, in addition to what Kimberly Woolridge said about the testimony that the department has received, weekly, we receive numerous calls with questions about assistance animals, and we understand that it's a murky area out there, a lot of miscommunication, misinformation. So today, this panel is going to try to help us navigate and wade through that. So joining us today, we have on the far side of the panel, on the left side in the red shirt, we have Amy Nelson, who is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, joining us all the way from Indiana. In the middle, yay! In the middle, we have Nedra Campbell, who is an Assistant U.S. Attorney with the United States Attorney's Office, Eastern District of Michigan. Thank you for joining us, Nedra. And on the end, we have we have Jill Goss, who is the trustee with Leader Dogs for the Blind. And although you can't see Twinkie, Twinkie is her leader dog, and Twinkie is under the table and is joining us today as well. So give it up for Jill and Twinkie. I just want to go over quickly the ground rules. I know they've been said in every session, but we just want to make sure that we understand that our lens and our focus today is fair housing. We know all housing is important, but today we're particularly talking about discrimination, bias, and disparate impact investigations. We want to come out of this session, as every other session that we've done so far, with one or two, three really good policy recommendations, because we know that we want to effectuate change. Having conferences is great, but we want to effectuate some change. So we'll get started right away. The first question we will pose to Nedra. Can you tell us the legal definition of a service animal? Which laws govern service animals? And then if you could speak about any enforcement cases or actions that your department is taking.
Sure. First, I want to thank you all, MDCR, for having me and for extending this invitation to my office. And a lot of the members of my team are right over there. If you guys will just wave your hand. They're all joining us from the U.S. Attorney's Office. So, two of the most frequently federal laws that are implicated when we are talking about service animals are the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. So under Title II of the ADA, which applies to state and local governments, and under Title III of the ADA, which applies to businesses that are open to the public, a service animal is defined as a dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. Again, a service animal is a dog of any breed and is of any size that has been trained to perform a task directly related to a person's disability. So a service animal may perform a number of tasks out there. It could be guiding a person with a vision impairment. It could be retrieving objects, reminding a person to take medication, or detecting the onset of a seizure or a panic attack. For example, a person who has limited mobility may have a dog that is trained to retrieve objects for him. A person with depression may have a dog that is trained to remind that person to take their medication. A person with PTSD may have a dog that is trained to lick the person to warn that person that they're going to have an onset of a panic attack. A person who has epilepsy may have a dog that is trained to detect the onset of a seizure and to make sure that that person is safe while having a seizure. Now, I want to say a little bit about miniature horses. A miniature horse is not a service animal, but a miniature horse may be a modification or an accommodation to a person. So, for example, if a person needs a service animal, and that person needs a service animal because that person has vertigo, for example, and may be prone to falling, they might be entitled to have a miniature horse to assist as opposed to a dog because of the height and the stature of the miniature horse. Just another reminder is that it's not just physical disabilities. The examples that I just gave you should suggest that it covers mental disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, or sensory disabilities as well. So in contrast, the Fair Housing Act requires housing providers to make reasonable accommodations for assistance animals. So this includes not only service animals, but also support animals, such as emotional support animals. So I'm going to just tell you what the definition is of an assistance animal. It is an animal that does work or performs tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability or provides emotional support or other assistance that may be necessary to afford that person the ability to use, like housing. So it can be any type of animal to mitigate the effects of a physical or a mental disability. The key to understanding this is that the definition of an assistance animal is broader than a service animal, but the places they can go are more limited. So one way of thinking about this is a person who has anxiety that needs to have an emotional support animal. They may not be entitled to take that emotional support animal into the movie theater with them under the ADA. However, they may be entitled to have that emotional support animal with them in housing, because that emotional support animal will allow that person to use the house and so forth. So that kind of takes me into the enforcement aspect of it. And I'm also pleased that I got a chance to meet Tim Moran from our housing office in Washington, D.C. If you want to raise your hand, Tim. One of the cases that I pulled up was a case that initially it originated with a complaint with HUD, and then it was litigated by the Department of Justice, so with his office, and then with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it was against an apartment complex that did not allow a person who had an emotional support animal to have this dog there. It was a Chihuahua. It had been trained to alert the person of strangers by barking. The apartment complex had a no pet policy, and it did not want any dogs at all, but they certainly didn't want the barky Chihuahua. And our office was able to litigate, Department of Justice was able to litigate that case, and the company had to change policies and so forth, and the person who was denied the housing was paid $33,000 in relief. So that is an example of one of the enforcement activities that can occur if an apartment complex denies people housing.
Thank you, Nedra. Next question is for Amy Nelson. Nedra did touch a little bit on other assistance animals outside of service animals, but could you speak a little bit more detail about animals distinct and separate from the ADA-defined service animal, and touch on maybe some unique animals, and then what are some differences in verifying a support animal as opposed to a service animal?
Sure. So as a fair housing center, and the state of Michigan has several fair housing centers, we receive a number of allegations or complaints from individuals who may be struggling in receiving approval for an accommodation request for their animal. As was defined, there are differences between the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. Under that, the differences are largely because where you live, your home is your safe place. That's where you go to feel safe, to be you, to let yourself dream or live. And it's different than when going into a more public accommodation, a place of employment or a restaurant. As such, with the Fair Housing Act allows for certainly a wider breadth of different types of animals. The key is, does the individual have an impairment that substantially limits a major life function? And is there a need of that animal to assist them? Is there a nexus to assist them with their impairment in enjoying their housing like somebody without a disability? As a result, very commonly, ADA, miniature horses, dogs. But in housing, it could be cats, it could be other types of animals. Somebody who might be allergic to dogs or cats may need a different type of animal within that. The other thing to keep in mind is that in housing, individuals cannot be charged additional pet fees or pet rents. The animal is not a pet. If that individual meets that definition, that impairment, that definition of disability, it can show that nexus, that need of that animal, they cannot be charged additional pet rent or pet deposits. It's not a pet. It's looked upon in similar ways that that a walking cane or other types of needs to help somebody with a disability is looked upon as part of that. When it comes to rules, certainly individuals who live at housing properties need to follow the same sort of rules as anybody else. If tenants or condominium or homeowners associations require you to pick up trash, you need to clean up after your animal as well, or have a process in place, or request some sort of accommodation if so needed. So you've got to follow the rules, having the animal properly leashed, and ensuring that excessive, noise, items such as that. So those rules can certainly be applied as long as those type of rules are applied to those without forms of disability. So for instance, if a housing provider finds a person with a disability and alleges that they aren't properly cleaning up, but doesn't find the family who is throwing trash off their balcony, that then establishes that the individual with the disability is being treated differently. So those rules, again, can be in place. They just need to be fairly applied to everybody. As far as the last piece of the question, as far as certification, there is no national certification process. There is a number of places out there that may claim to be a form of certification. At the end of the day, what the individual has to establish is that their impairment meets the definition of disability under law, and they can show a need for that animal. Coming out of COVID, we are seeing a higher use of telehealth. It's much harder for people to timely get into their regular doctor's appointments. There's also a cost very often for individuals in being able to do that as well. And so we need to be conscious that telehealth may be a means for individuals to be able to provide verification that they meet the disability definition and have a need. The last thing I'll say is that, on this question, is that if somebody comes to a housing provider and they are requesting an accommodation for an animal of this type, if the individual's impairment is not physically obvious, a housing provider does have the right to request verification to ensure that the individual meets that definition of disability and has the need for the animal. But if the impairment is visually obvious, the guidance has been published by HUD, establishes that it's unnecessary to prove to you that the individual meets that definition of disability. So for instance, somebody comes in using a walker, uses a wheelchair, has an animal with them. It would be unfair to say, prove to me that you have a disability, your impairment rises to disability under law, and you have a need for their animal. But somebody with a hidden condition may come, whether that is intellectual, mental, physical, a heart condition. The housing provider may be within their right then to establish that request additional verification to establish that they meet that definition of disability and have a need for that accommodation.
Thank you, Amy. Next question is for Jill. Can you describe some of your experiences in visiting places of public accommodation, so businesses that are open to the public, any state or local government businesses, or just traveling in general with a service animal? Things that you wish people knew or understood about interacting with a person who uses a service animal, and then finally, just barriers that people with service animals encounter.
Thank you, Tyra. This is Jill speaking. I have many, many stories, but just recently, my husband and I went and rented a place, and they insisted that we stay at a pet-friendly. And I said, no, I don't want a pet-friendly. This is my service dog. So it's the only room we have left. I'm like, okay. So then what happened was I went to take my leader dog outside at night to have her go to the bathroom. And there was a couple coming in with this huge dog, a pet. And they said, no, no, don't worry, don't worry. And I'm like, this is my guide dog, so of course I worry. Oh, no, 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 don't worry. So she was out of harness. We were, like I said, getting ready to go to bed and go outside. So then something clicked in me. I don't know what it was. And I turned really quick and covered Twinkie. And the dog actually jumped on my back and was growling and barking and trying to get to Twinkie. So I had said something, and they said, oh, whatever, whatever, whatever. And there was another time that rented a place, and this was a house. And I didn't say, we don't have to say that we have a service dog. But the landlord found out that I had a service dog. And his wife came into the house without knocking. My husband was with me, and just started screaming in my face. So I said, you know, back off, because I didn't know what was happening. I'm deaf and blind, and I didn't know what was happening. And my husband was saying, hey, you know, back off, what? And she said, well, I'm going to call the police. So I turned and looked at my husband, and he said, you're going to call the police? I said, please do. And I said, any closer, I'm no self-defense, so don't touch me. And I said, don't touch my service dog. Please, do not touch. Well, the next thing I know, a couple days later, Jim and I were just sitting watching TV and at the same place, and all of a sudden a guy comes in and just starts throwing ant traps all over the house. And obviously we know how dangerous ant traps are. So those are a couple of the experiences. These are the barriers that when somebody looks at me, they say, oh, she looks normal. And so when it's like, what do you mean normal? Well, you don't need a service dog. Yes, I do. Anybody that has a service dog, we have our dogs for a reason. And all I ask, one of the biggest things, is ask us questions. Talk to us. We're happy to educate. That's the biggest thing, is we need our dog. Twinkie, my guide dogs are the best thing for me. I'm independent, and my self-esteem, and I can live a life. I can travel alone. But when it comes to people that don't understand, what we ask is you please ask and educate yourself, because I don't know what I would do without my leader dog. So.
Thank you, Jill. We'll go back to Nedra, and then I will go to Amy, and I hope we can kind of keep these answers brief. To Nedra, if you could identify or let us know, where is a service animal allowed to go? I'm sorry, Nedra, just the service animal, the ADA-defined service animal, because I'll ask Amy about the other types under the Fair Housing Act.
This is Nedra speaking, and a service animal is allowed to go pretty much anywhere a person can go.
Thank you. Okay, and so with the ADA, in those places are identified very particularly in terms of public accommodations, public service.
Right, so like the public accommodation places, I just referenced like Title II of the ADA, which applies to like municipality places, Title III, which applies to businesses that are open to the public. So that would include like the example I gave with theaters, a swimming pool, public library, a university, place, pretty much anywhere that you can think of that a person can go under the ADA. A service animal should be able to accompany a person. There might be some limited circumstances. So say, for example, a person who has a service animal, that person is at a doctor's office. They would be able to go to the doctor's office, but what about in a surgery environment? It might be that they need a sterile environment because of surgery. In that particular situation, a service animal might not be able to go into the operating room because of those limitations. But beyond like that type of limitation, a service animal should be able to accompany a person anywhere they can go. You've heard from my panelists, she needs her service animal. I certainly wouldn't want to go anywhere without my eyes, for example. So if you think about that, that's how broad it is in terms of a service animal being able to go under the ADA.
Thank you, Nedra. So on the flip side of that, Amy, can you tell us under the Fair Housing Act, with respect to rental properties, are there limitations to where an assistance animal could go? Are they solely relegated to the household, the living quarters, or are there other areas that they're allowed to go?
So need to clarify that this may not just include rental housing. This can include condos associations, homeowners associations, where individuals may own their condo and homeowners and home as well. Fair housing laws would apply in those situations in addition to rental as well. So the key here is, what is the property's rules? If this is a property that has no restrictions related to animals, there shouldn't be any issues. The individual can go with their animal anywhere on the property where the animals are allowed. Where we need reasonable accommodations is when there's rules or limitations by the property on where animals can go. And in those situations, typically those are pet-targeted rules that then impact individuals with disabilities who have a need of an animal of some kind. So then an accommodation request needs to be made. And that may be in a property that has a no animals allowed rule, that the accommodation is that I am allowed to reside here with my needed animal. Or it could be, other types of policies. Animals are not allowed, animals might be allowed to live in properties, but can't go on certain trails within an HOA. Again, there could be an accommodation made that due to the need of the individual, that the animal is then allowed on those because it's not a pet, it's an animal that's needed for the disability. So it really depends upon what is the rule or policy, what is the restriction, and what are the individual needs of that individual with the disability as to how that animal may assist them.
Thank you, Amy. We'll move on to probably the last question we'll be able to get to before our Q&A. We want to leave time for that. This will go to Jill. Jill, there's a great deal of misinformation and miscommunication about specific training requirements for service animals, and we're just talking about service animals here. Can you tell us if there are specific training requirements for service animals, entities that you have to go through, or can individuals train their own animals?
Am I on testing? Am I on? Okay, this is Jill speaking. Service animals, we can even train our own service animals if needed. I will focus on guide dogs. They do follow an international guide dog federation. So they are trained at a guide dog school. But anybody else with a service animal can train their own dog. And the other thing is, we take care of our own dogs, and that's one of the biggest things, is we feed them, we water them, we potty them, we take them to the vet, we do what we need to do to take care of our own animals. And sometimes also what happens is a barrier is people will just automatically come up and just start talking to the animal itself. And that is a huge distraction. And me with the guide dog, that is huge, because what is Twinkie going to want to do when you're like, oh, what a cute dog, oh my goodness, she's beautiful. She's automatically going to look to that person and say, oh, so Twinkie may get distracted, and then something serious could happen to the two of us. Okay?
Yep. Okay, thank you. It looks like we have time for one more, and so I'll pose this to Amy and to any panelist if you really want to answer. Do you have any suggestions? Again, the summit, the purpose is to effectuate change. So something that we could take away for greater enforcement, oversight of landlords or property managers when it comes to assistance animals. And I guess I'll start with Amy on that.
If you are in the rental business or in the leasing business, or you're on an HOA or condo board, HUD has issued some really comprehensive guidance over the years on this subject. Make sure that the individuals who interact with residents at the property have reviewed that material, are trained, participate in trainings like this, go to trainings of your area fair housing centers. They do much more in-depth trainings than we have the time to do a day on this subject, as well as other disability-related needs. Have published policies on reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications, so it's clear to individuals how they can make those requests and the method of which to start that process. And it's important to also be affirmative. Have fair housing posters, up in your office. Have mechanisms for individuals that if a complaint is filed against a property staff person, that there is an investigative process to determine if some sort of corrective action needs to be taken, what happened, and to make sure that the individual with disabilities, that their rights are adequately enforced.
Thank you, Amy, and same question to you, Nedra.
So this morning, you will recall the individual talked about the two people who did not know where to report these issues. And so I would say we cannot, when I say we, the Department of Justice, United States Attorney's Office, cannot address issues that we don't know about. So I would say file a complaint with us so we can look into it. You can go to the national website, justice.gov. I'm going to give you the hotline telephone number, so get your pens out. That number is 313-226-9151. Again, that number is 313-226-9151. If you forget the number, just know that you can contact the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Michigan and file a complaint. Let us know so that we can look into it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for our panel. I really appreciate you taking the time today to educate us on this very complicated subject. Now we have 15 minutes for Q&A. We have two monitors in the room with microphones. So if you have a question, we have Caitlin and Amanda, and I see a hand over here in the middle. Wait till the microphone gets to you, please, and then identify yourself before speaking. And then if you also would like a particular panelist to answer your question.
Hi, Bethany Hedgepath with the Boyne City Housing Commission. I'm the executive director. I guess it doesn't really matter who answers, but I feel like we train our staff really well on it, but how can we train our other residents on how to not discriminate against each other? Because we get a lot of, well, I wasn't allowed to have that dog, why'd you let them have that dog? And I can't have two dogs, why do they get to have two dogs? Or, you know, how can we stop that? Because I feel like that is also our responsibility to stop that. Whether it actually is or not, I don't really know that. That might be another question. But I feel like there other responsibilities or things that we could do besides just putting posters on the wall for the actual residents at that level for public housing.
I guess I'll go. This is Amy. Whether it is public housing or other forms of housing here, from my perspective, I should have prefaced, I am not an attorney and nothing I say today is legal advice. I should have prefaced that at the start of this particular workshop on there. Unfortunately, when it comes to that type of selective targeting as it relates to animals, is not only individuals with disabilities or with animals. We see this, we get complaints, neighbor on neighbor type harassment happening due to race, color, religion, across all the 7 federally protected classes. I think a landlord or a housing provider that is proactive in notifying residents about how harassment will be handled, that there is an effective investigative mechanism by management to determine if somebody is going too far, versus educating them about the broader rights that individuals might have or what the law might be. You could offer, if you have a community room as a public housing authority, have speakers come in and to talk, open it up to all residents at the property. Whether it is, I would just encourage that it not only be on animals, but be on other topics certainly as well. Because again, harassment, my experience has been, and I have not been at this as long as some others. I started in 1997. But unfortunately what I've seen is that when you have residents who will harass or point out, it's probably not going to be limited to just that one particular area. It's going to be other areas as well. So let's try to make sure that they know what they might be held accountable for, what may happen if they are found to violate lease rules when it comes to their interactions with others. And maybe it's not going that far. It's just individuals that aren't knowledgeable, and that's where a training mechanism may be able to be offered, or a fact sheet that goes out to everybody at the property, something like that.
This is Tyra. Yes, go ahead, Jill.
Also, I would just suggest talk to the person with the service dog and ask them how they would like to handle it. In Detroit, I have been asked to go to 2 different senior citizen places, and one friend is deafblind with a leader dog and another one blind with a leader dog. And I just went in and did a presentation. You know, they had bingo and food, and of course everybody goes to bingo and food. So, and I just did a presentation and talked about the do's and the don'ts of service animals. And, you know, not everybody was able to come, but like we say, if one person's like, oh, Jill came and talked, and we're supposed to do this and not that. So that's very important. So talk to the person with the service animal and see how they would like to handle it. I think that would be big.
Tyra speaking, thank you. Any other questions? We have a few minutes. Don't see any. All right, Tyra speaking, I don't see any additional questions. Thank you very much to our panel today for joining us and sharing your wisdom and time.